This is the School Leadership Show, the only podcast dedicated to helping practicing and aspiring school leaders improve their craft. The School Leadership Show brings together thought leaders from inside and outside of education to deliver you the insights and tools you need to succeed in school leadership. Jenn David Lang of The Main Idea returns to the show, and we talk with Justin Baeder, the author of Now We're Talking, 21 Days to High Performance Instructional Leadership. Justin discusses his model for turning daily classroom visits into a powerful habit for instructional improvement. He offers a practical approach to mastering this high-leverage technique for helping teachers reflect on their practice and grow as professionals. Now We're Talking is available everywhere, and you can learn more about Justin and his work at instructionalleadershipchallenge.com. You can reach Jenn through her website for The Main Idea, themainidea.net. She offered to send listeners of this episode a free summary of Now We're Talking if you send her an email at jen.david-lang@themainidea.net. Enjoy this conversation with Jenn David Lang and Justin Baeder. I'm here with Jenn David Lang. Welcome back, Jenn.
Hi.
I feel like you're my co-host. Really.
Practically, yeah.
And Jenn and I have a special guest here with us today, Justin Baeder, the author of Now We're Talking, 21 Days to High Performance Instructional Leadership. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Mike.
Thanks for coming. So let's see. So Jenn, why don't you get us started and talk a little bit about why you chose Justin's book to summarize, and then maybe we'll get into the kind of maybe a little bit from Justin on the history of how you came to write it. So go ahead, Jenn.
Sure. I chose to feature Justin's book in my most recent issue of The Main Idea. Because I've read a lot about instructional leadership, lots of books, and I really appreciate Justin's approach, and we will get into that, to dealing with veteran leaders. I think a lot of people have ideas about how to move our new teachers forward, but he had a very respectful and thoughtful approach to how we move our more experienced teachers forward in a way that's not just about correcting small mistakes, but about raising the level of teachers' thinking. And that really respects the profession of teacher. And I also like his practical approach, which he will tell you he has a 21-day instructional leadership challenge where he has been involved with over 10,000 school leaders from all over the country to help them make small changes every day for 21 days until they become stronger instructional leaders. So maybe Justin, you can talk a little bit more about the background in writing this book, but I really appreciated your book.
And Justin, maybe a little bit about your background. How did what's your path up through the ranks here?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And Jenn, thank you again for selecting the book. Really an honor to have it featured in The Main Idea. So yeah, Mike, I think the approach that's in the book really does come out of my experience as an elementary principal, and specifically my experience not really knowing what I was doing as an instructional leader, to be honest. I moved from being a middle school science teacher to being an elementary principal. And, I think that gap in terms of personal experience teaching going into leadership, we all supervise teachers who teach things that we never taught, right? Every principal does that. The only difference in my situation was virtually everybody I was supervising taught things that I had never taught. and as you've alluded to, I had a veteran staff that for the most part was extremely strong, that was very professional. And I noticed that a lot of the books that I was reading about helping teachers get better, about feedback, about walkthroughs, about coaching, a lot of them seem to be written from this perspective that all of our teachers are new, none of them know what they're doing, they're terrible, we need to help them get better very, very quickly, they have these huge improvements they need to make. And I looked at my staff and I was like, that is not what I am dealing with here. So if I treat these people who've been doing this for 20, 25 years like they're rookies, I'm going to get run out of here quick. I'm not going to help anybody, and they're going to hate me, and I'm going to be a complete failure at this job. So I really had to find a different way to work with the teachers that I worked with, and that's the approach that became the book, 10 years later.
So, wow. Okay, so a lot there. So let's start there. That's a situation that I think a lot of newly minted administrators face, because typically you're not coming into a school where everybody's brand new. You're usually the newest person there if it's your first gig.
Yeah.
So talk about, well, let's jump right in. So do you want to walk us through the days? What do you think is a good way to give people an overview?
Yeah, well, I think the beginning with the end in mind is really important. And if we want to get into classrooms, often our first thought is, I need to help people improve. And that's kind of our motivation. Okay, I need to get into classrooms. I need to find opportunities for improvement. I need to coach teachers. And again, going back to my story as a rookie principal, I had that motivation, but I knew I also didn't have the knowledge. So one of my goals right out of the gate was to gain that knowledge and to figure out, okay, what does good practice look like in kindergarten? I'd never taught kindergarten. I had no idea how to run a kindergarten classroom, teach reading, all of those things that kindergarten teachers are responsible for. So I really made it my goal not to fix the teacher, not to fix, as Jenn says, those small mistakes, but to really learn, and to be a leader who was learning first, so that whatever I was leading with knowledge of what was actually taking place there. And whatever I wanted to change, ultimately, I would have had a clear sense of what was actually going on in the first place. So in terms of the model, I think it would probably be helpful to kind of clarify what we're talking about here, because everybody seems to have heard of walkthroughs, right? Everybody's heard of getting into classrooms, giving some sort of feedback to teachers, collecting some sort of information. And I found that a lot of what I was doing in those walkthroughs, if I would try to implement some other model, was difficult and kind of took my eyes off of what I fundamentally needed to be doing, which was paying attention. And I found that paying attention, if that was my goal, paying attention and learning, whatever needed to happen in any specific classroom could happen from there, if I didn't give myself the distraction of, okay, I need to fill out this form. Every time I go into classrooms, I need to fill out this form. And I think this form obsession is almost universal. I was obsessed with forms. I was obsessed with paper forms and carbon forms and non-carbon forms and electronic forms. And, we have all these different ways of making forms. But it eventually dawned on me that, people don't want forms. People don't need forms. And it was really like a box for me to tick in my head that, okay, I've done my job if I've filled out a form, even though that wasn't really what anybody wanted. I didn't want to have a form-based conversation with people, and it kind of, it's like for most people, the last form that someone else filled out about them was a speech. It's the only time when people fill out forms about us as adults in society, right? So I thought, we've got to get away from that and make it something else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That getting away from that sort of rote kind of compliance model. And you did that by anchoring into existing documents, right? It's not like you went out and created some new framework, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had to look at, what are we already doing? What is our curriculum? What are our teacher evaluation criteria? And that was a little bit easier to generate a focus on among staff because we were changing our teacher evaluation system at the time. So it really forced me to look at the specifics and say, okay, what are we really working toward here? What is this curriculum about? What's our math curriculum about? What is this new writing curriculum about? And I found that it was actually easier to have those conversations when something was changing, but I found that it was just as critical for me to have those conversations even if things hadn't changed in a long time, because I wasn't necessarily familiar with them as the new person coming in.
Can you share, because the three of us have read the book and maybe the listeners have not, the key components of what your model looks like?
Sure, yeah. So the main idea, not the main idea of the newsletter, but the main idea of the model is to get into classrooms every day, about 3 times a day, and just visit teachers on an informal basis and see what's going on in their classrooms, talk with them briefly, stay for 5, 10, 15 minutes, come back later if you need to, if the teacher's not available to chat. Keep track of those visits. So when I say informal, I don't mean careless, but informal in the sense of this is not a big thing that the two of us arrange ahead of time. I just drop by whenever I can to see that teacher, to see whatever's going on at that time. I don't expect the teacher to send me anything in advance, and I don't expect that I'm going to see a perfect lesson. I expect that I'm going to see just kind of a typical day, and I don't necessarily expect that I'm going to have some very specific feedback to give. But I do think I'm going to learn something. I do go in with the expectation that I'm going to see something that's worth talking about, that's worth having a conversation about, and that both I and the teacher are going to get something out of that conversation. So it's going to be worthwhile. It's going to build our relationship. It's going to help both of us learn and reflect on our practice as educators. And I found that was kind of the cornerstone habit for me as an instructional leader. Getting into classrooms made more of a difference than anything else. And on those days when I got into classrooms, I knew it was a successful day. No matter how many other things happen that are kind of outside of our control, if we can get into classrooms on a consistent basis, we can make the right things happen outside of that.
Now, I agree with you completely, and I think that the best job I ever had, and probably the best job in the world, is elementary school principal, no doubt. Now, how did you roll this out to staff? You must have had some kind of communication up front, so they would know what to expect, right?
Well, I think there's this appeal to the idea of making some sort of grand announcement because we feel like we'll hold ourselves accountable to it if we make it public and we say, attention everyone, I will be visiting classrooms. And, I probably did that to some extent. And, if somebody's starting a new school year or they read the book and they think, okay, I'm going to do this, it's tempting to make some sort of grand announcement like that. But I think the reality is when we do something like that, somebody is going to get upset. Somebody's going to get scared that, whatever secret they're worried about is going to get found out, or there's going to be some sort of resistance to that. And I think that resistance comes from a very real fear that it's going to be a bad thing. And often that fear comes from experience, that teachers have had bad experiences of administrators being in their classrooms, even when they weren't doing anything wrong. So what I recommend in the book, I'm not sure, honestly, if this is what I did personally, because it was a long time ago, but what I recommend is just get started. Don't make a big deal about it. Pop into a classroom for a few minutes, and early on, make an even less big deal about it. Only stay for 1 or 2 minutes, just make an appearance, and just kind of break the ice rather than, making this grand announcement and having a plan and giving people a schedule and all these things that make it seem like a big deal. My argument to staff when I ultimately did talk about it was, this is the core of how I do a good job. Like, I need to know where we are as a school. I need to know how to support you. So I'm just here for that purpose. And then eventually do make more of a formal announcement and clarify goals a little bit more. One thing that I want to caution people not to do, because I hear this all the time, you don't want to say these are non-evaluative visits, because I believe that everything we do kind of shapes our understanding of where teachers are. Every interaction we have gives us information about where a teacher is, and that is going to impact our final evaluation. So we want to not make too grand an announcement up front, but we also want to be open with people about what our purposes are.
And one of the things I really like about your approach is that one of the benefits has to do with making decisions for the school based on the frontline evidence you gather from these visits. So you give a great example of some higher ups at Toyota going to see what's happening on the assembly line so they can make larger decisions about parts, pieces, ordering, other things, and that you are genuinely there as a principal to be in classrooms, because how can you possibly make decisions about staffing, professional development, scheduling, if you don't know what's happening on the front lines? So I think by communicating with your actions that you are genuinely there to learn. You're not there to ask those kinds of questions where you're fishing for the correct answer, but you want to see what's happening in the school. And by conveying that by your actions to help prevent some of that resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great way to demonstrate that is just, if you can make some of your first actions supportive, not you telling teachers what they need to do differently the first time you get in their classroom, but actually identifying something that you as a leader can do to support them or respond to a request or help a student. When we show that by our actions, I think it speaks louder than any kind of announcement at a staff meeting could.
And one of Justin's suggestions at I think day 11, the action challenge, is try not giving suggestions for a while. And when you tell that to most principals, that's really hard to do. I mean, it's hard as parents at home, and it's hard to actually visit a class and not give a suggestion. But as you mentioned, that when we go in and we visit classrooms, we are seeing a very small part of what's happening, and we've spent a lot less time thinking about the lessons than the teachers have. So without having some conversation and hearing more about the context, we really are not equipped to make the most appropriate suggestion from visiting a classroom for 10 minutes.
Yeah. And I think that just comes out of kind of a high view of teachers as professionals. We've all worked with people who maybe did not deserve a high view of their work as professional work, but I think that's rare. Across the profession, it is a profession. By and large, people are doing professional work, and that means the way we lead that work and the way we supervise that work as administrators needs to reflect the professional nature of it. And specifically by the professional nature of teaching, I mean that teachers are making their own decisions about how to do their jobs on a daily basis. This is not flipping burgers. This is a job where professional judgment comes into play on a routine basis, not just every once in a while, but like professional judgment for teachers is at the core of their work. And I think that's got to show up in how we supervise and how we talk to teachers.
Well, and I think you did a nice job bringing that forth when you kind of talk, I guess role play isn't the word, but sort of describe how conversations might go. And Jenn and I love that stuff. When people give us things to say, it helps. But I think one of the things that you did, and I think it comes out, is that you are presuming positive, thoughtful, professional decision-making on the part of the teacher. Mm-hmm. So I'm coming in with that presumed competence, which I think that takes a lot of the air out of the system and calms people down, where, I'm coming in believing that you are making choices in the best interest of your students versus looking for where you messed up so I can give you a suggestion.
And I think it's about leveraging your time as a principal, as well as respecting the teacher. So if you observe a teacher and you see, something small that could be corrected, sure, you might be able to talk to that teacher and have that small item corrected. But what about the 99% of the other decisions that teacher has to make, like you're saying, Mike? So instead, what's a better use of our time to equip teachers to make better decisions in the future? If all you talk about is what you saw in the past, it's almost like the analogy of the autopsy. Do you want to spend your time on the autopsy, or do you want to spend time helping teachers develop their decision making in the future? So by sharing, these are some of the things that I saw in your class. Here are my low inference notes. What would you do next time? You're strengthening those decision making muscles as well as respecting them, so that tomorrow and the next day and all of those other decisions that you will certainly not be present for, they can develop the skills to make better decisions.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I think it's worth pointing out here that what we're not talking about is focusing on the teacher's behavior. And that I think is probably one of the biggest differences between this model and other walkthrough models, is we're not just saying you did X. Why did you do X? Why don't you do Y or Z instead? Because it's kind of that autopsy, that second guessing, and it's focusing on behavior that has already occurred rather than the thinking that needs to continue to happen in the future. And again, back to that idea of professional judgment. And one thing that I think is a very practical way that people can, Mike, you used the term presume rather than assume just a minute ago when you talked about kind of presuming that that the teacher is a professional and that the teacher is competent. I don't think we have to assume that everybody does a great job at everything, but we can presume it. I love the way you said that, in the way that we talk with teachers about their practice. And when it comes to a teacher who has a gap, when we want them to be able to do something that they're not currently able to do, if we presume their competence and then talk about it, we can learn a lot more than if we just recognize maybe their incompetence and try to fix it directly. So like, let's say, I like to give this example because I'm pretty sure this is one that I didn't have as a new teacher. I'm pretty sure that when I graduated from college, I did not know what formative assessment was, and like, it's hard to figure out when you didn't know something.
Right.
If you can't really pinpoint when you learned it. But I'm pretty sure as a first year teacher, I had no idea what formative assessment was. And if my principal had come into my classroom and said, Justin, did you use formative assessment? I would probably say, okay, to myself, I'd probably say, okay, formative assessment must be a thing. I think I should be doing formative assessment. So I'd say, yeah. So formative assessment, I really need to formatively get a sense of where my students are. So, and I'd go into this kind of like rambling, make it up as I go along explanation for why I use formative assessment and why it matters. And, it's evidence-based and the research really says I can make up just about any response if somebody says to me, why did you do this or why didn't you do that? And we get into justification when we ask why questions. So one really practical strategy that I want to share with people is if you want to know why someone did or did not do something, don't ask them a why question, because when you ask a why, you'll get a justification. Instead, ask them a how question. Because when you ask a how question, you'll still get the justification, but you'll also get the explanation. And if the explanation is lacking, that's what you really need to know as an instructional leader to get that teacher to where they need to be. So if my principal had said, Justin, talk to me about how you use formative assessment, and I open my mouth and start talking about formative assessment, which, remember, I know nothing about as a first-year teacher, my principal is going to very quickly realize that I'm putting her on and I don't really know anything about it. And she's also going to realize that it's not going to work to just tell me, Justin, you need to start using formative assessment. Because remember, I don't know what it is. So I can show up tomorrow and try my best to use formative assessment, but it's not a behavioral thing. It's a professional development thing. I don't need to just implement formative assessment. I need to understand it. I need to go to a class. I need to get some coaching. I need to have some training and professional learning. And all of the supervision in the world, my principal can come every day and lay down that expectation that I use formative assessment, and it's not going to change my practice because I simply don't know what I need to know. But if we've had that conversation and the principal's gotten the sense that, okay, Justin kind of rambled on about formative assessment to such an extent that I know that he doesn't know what that is, so I'm going to send Justin to this workshop on formative assessment, and hopefully that will get us somewhere. And next time we have this conversation, after Justin's been to that formative assessment workshop, I can see what he learned. I can say, so Justin, you went to that workshop a couple weeks ago with the science department on formative assessment strategies and prompts to use with your middle school science students. So talk to me about how you're using formative assessment these days and what you're learning from it. And then the principal can get a sense of where I really am. Maybe they'll learn some things from me if I picked up some hot new stuff at the workshop. And we can really have a conversation that moves both of us forward rather than just this kind of defensive, did I give a satisfactory answer about formative assessment? Did I go home and Google an Edutopia article, the night before my post conference because I knew I was going to have to speak to formative assessment? And I think the more we take that authentic approach and just talk with people as human beings who have a shared mission and a shared goal to serve our students, we all get better through that conversation.
And these are the sentence starters that Mike and I like. You give examples of how to ask these how questions as an evidence-based question, where you encourage the principal to use what they saw in the classroom. So, for example, quote, I noticed that you blah, blah, blah. Could you talk to me about how that fits into this lesson or unit? I noticed that students blah, blah, blah. How did that compare with what you expected to happen when you planned the lesson? Here's what I saw, blah, blah, blah. How does that compare with what you thought was happening at the time? So I like that structure of here's the evidence, now here's my how question as you describe it, Justin. The first part, the evidence, the second part is the how. And the reason why I think your model is useful is that you may not have been using formative assessment strategies because you didn't know what they were, or you might not have thought they were appropriate at this time. And so if I'm just the principal observing, I don't really know that difference. So if I say, I noticed this, how did you use formative assessment strategies? Then you're filling in the context.
Yeah.
And you're, as you suggest to principals, be open to the possibility that your harsher judgments may be wrong. And that's absolutely true. There are many reasons, in the same way that, with students don't answer a question. Sometimes they don't know how, but sometimes they just didn't eat breakfast that morning and they're spaced out. So it helps us to understand the context, and you're trying to encourage principals to better understand the context before jumping to the judgments.
Well, yeah, and I think context is not everything, but almost everything. When we see a lesson, even if we visit, every classroom every other week, as I recommend in the book, and get into classrooms about 500 times a year, we're still only seeing a tiny, tiny fraction of the total instruction. And I think there's this idea out there, and I don't know where this came from, but there's this idea out there that teaching is at all times kind of like figure skating or Olympic high diving, that it should just be this flawless performance all the time, and that any given 5 minutes that you pop into a classroom, you should be seeing this flawless performance with the triple axels and if we're doing high dives, I don't know the words for for fancy Olympic high dives.
Yeah, a triple Lindy, right? Wasn't that?
Yeah.
Back to school, maybe? I can't remember. But you're right. Yes, keep going, because I think you're dead on. Or how many times have you had you go to set up, you walk in and, the kids are working or they're doing something, and then the teacher catches you later and says, oh, I wish you'd come back when I was teaching, or something like that. And my response to that is, well, it's all teaching. Like, it's all part of what you're doing. They just happen to be working independently when I walked in.
Yeah, like, it's not wrong that I didn't see the little song and dance and backflip and triple axel when I walked into the room. Like, if you were doing something appropriate as a learning activity, that's great. Please keep doing that, and don't change it for my account, on my account, just because I came into your room. And that gets, Mike, I think at the issue of grain size, or the kind of the unit of analysis. Like, what are we really evaluating when we evaluate teachers? I think there's this idea out there that we evaluate the behavior in the moment. But if you look at the language of your evaluation system, it's very big picture. It's across the course of the whole school year. I want students to end up having learned what they were supposed to learn at the end of the year. I'm not as concerned with the teacher's actions in any given 2-minute or 5-minute period during the school year. You know what I mean? If I walk in and see something, obviously what I see should not be inappropriate. There are certain things that we never want. I don't want to see a teacher sitting at their desk reading the newspaper while the kids do whatever. But I also know that it's not my job to micromanage every moment of every behavior every day. What I really care about is our kids learning and our teachers growing. And to zoom back to the idea of context again, what's happening in those moments that we happen to observe has everything to do with what happened yesterday, with what's going to happen tomorrow. And often that's what we forget to ask about. We forget to ask, okay, you're doing this today, where are we in the unit? Where are we? Is formative assessment, or is a higher order question, or whatever I might think to be looking for, is that appropriate given where you are in this lesson and what you did yesterday, and the fact that half of your class is leaving in 5 minutes because there's a ball game? We've got to get that context because it matters for decision making.
Right. And I think, back to your point, that we're kind of where we started with decision making. I like to get at that, to ask questions. Or, I noticed that you checked in with Bobby when you were walking around while everybody was working independently. How do you decide in the moment who to check in with, and what other strategies have you found work for checking for understanding, or things like that? So again, I'm presuming that you use other strategies. I may know for a fact that all you do is stand up in front and talk, but I'm presuming I'm gonna let you go that way. And then that does a couple things. At least I've found is it lets them know that you think that they use a variety of strategies. It also gives you an opportunity to insert some too, to say, hey, I've seen some folks try this or whatever. I think sometimes we fall into it's easy to fall back into that suggestion habit of do this, do this, do this. But I find if I take myself out of it, kind of, as the administrator, and you ask those open-ended questions and guide people sometimes to their colleagues, or say, I've seen it done this way before, rather than, when I was a teacher, this is how I did it.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to this idea that I think I heard from John Hattie originally, when he talks a lot about effect sizes. And I think we as administrators tend to really push for specific strategies that we know work well. But Hattie, who has studied different instructional strategies probably more than anybody else on the planet, and compared them and read all these different studies of those specific strategies, one of the very surprising things that he says, if you've seen him speak, he says everything works. Every strategy under the sun works to some extent. And, we can measure the effect sizes, but a lot of it comes down to context. So this idea that we should be second guessing the specific strategies that people are using, I think is kind of dead in the water. And I think that we get so much more out of those conversations about, talk to me about, how do you do this? Where, what were you thinking in terms of where this kid's understanding was with this particular concept when you asked that question? Or what did you think of this student's answer to that question? We can learn so much through those conversations that gets teachers to do the intellectual work that they need to do to take their practice to the next level.
But I do think there's something to what Mike is saying about providing suggestions, not as in do this, but here are some ideas that are out there. Because I do think there's this question in education of will versus skill. And I think that for the most part, if teachers are not fully engaging students, checking for understanding, providing challenging tasks, for the most part, I don't think they're doing that because of a lack of will, that they're against engagement or rigorous teaching.
Right.
I do think that it is often a matter of skill, and not that they can't do it, but they're teaching all day. They don't necessarily have all of the resources at their fingertips. And I do think a part of a principal's role is as lead learner, somebody who is researching, reading materials, gathering and sharing resources, and also, like Mike says, even across the school. The principal may be the only one who is in everyone's classroom and can say, oh, wow, once the teacher owns and says, yeah, gee, I didn't realize I'm having trouble getting students engaged in deeper thinking, and the principal can share, there's some other classrooms I've seen with different approaches to deeper thinking right here in this building. I don't know what you think about that, Justin.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good point, that, as a new teacher, your bag of tricks is not deep enough, right? You have like one way to get students' attention and one way to assess their understanding, and you really do need more because it's just, once that one thing stops working, you're in trouble. And I definitely remember that feeling. I guess where I would say the real opportunity around that is in developing an instructional framework that not only lists those strategies, but has a rubric describing those strategies. And I think the danger of having too deep a bag of tricks is that, and like I always bristle when I hear people say this at a conference or after going to a conference, they'll say, oh yeah, I tried that. I'm thinking, like, hundreds of thousands of people make it work every day. So it's not the strategy itself that's a bad strategy. It's that there's nuance to how you use it. There's context to when it works. And often when we're sharing ideas, we share them without enough information to actually make the teacher successful. So I really like this idea of having, if we have a particular strategy for any aspect of teaching, having not just a name for that strategy, like try proximity. Try proximity if you want your kids to listen to you. Well, what does that actually look like? Let's make a rubric. And if we can't make a rubric, we probably shouldn't be telling people to do it, because they're probably going to do something other than what we have in mind. So that specificity makes all the difference in the world. And I think I probably learned that in terms of curriculum specific pedagogy, actually having a rubric behind specific strategies. I probably learned that from Lucy Calkins and her Readers and Writers Workshop units, because they do have rubrics for very specific things. Like, something that I might tell teachers is, hey, when you're teaching this lesson, this mini lesson on this particular writing strategy, keep your mini lesson short. It should be no more than 10 minutes. And I can tell a teacher that, but and they can try to hold themselves accountable to that expectation. But if we don't have more detail on what that actually looks like, what does unsatisfactory look like in terms of short? Like, is it short because the timer went off and we just stopped abruptly? Or is it short because I've developed an appropriate scope for that 10-minute mini lesson and I figured out a way to manage student behavior so that we get done what we need to in that time? Like, there's nuance to it that goes beyond, here, do X. And I think that's where an instructional framework or a rubric for what that looks like can be enormously helpful to people.
And I think that's where being in classrooms frequently supports that kind of work, because then you can have the conversations around, if I see, let's say I see chunks of the same teacher's mini lessons over the course of an entire semester, hopefully I've seen things change over time, and that can be part of that conversation.
Yeah. And I think you can also see the same lesson. I love when I got to see the same lesson in different teachers' classrooms, and you can kind of see the difference between how people approach things. And I think it's totally fine to shamelessly, steal ideas from people's colleagues and transfer them. And, you can you can give credit where credit's due. But if you see something that's not working in one classroom, chances are it is working next door. And man, that's a great resource.
Can you talk a little bit about, I really love the way you phrased using the instructional framework as like a neutral third party. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think that gets us out of this idea of opinion and power, that as the supervisor, I have a certain amount of power and my opinion has power separate from my expertise, right? Just because I'm the principal, people are supposed to listen to me. And I knew that there was a big difference. As a new principal, I knew I had the power, but not the expertise. And I wanted to make sure that what I was advising people to do was actually a good thing to do. And that instructional framework really played that role of saying, okay, it's not just my opinion. I don't know where I got this phrase, but the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion that matters.
I love it.
Don't pay attention to the hippo. Like, we really need these to be shared expectations, because I need to support you in learning whatever you need to learn to meet those expectations. And they're not just my expectations. I'm not just the dictator of instruction and everybody needs to do what I say. Like, I don't want that job of being the policeman in my school. So I really do want these to be outside of my head and outside of your head. I want them to be a third party in the conversation. And in our school, for the most part, that came from our curriculum. So we had Lucy Calkins was the writer of a lot of that framework that we used in reading and writing. We had a great math curriculum that provided some pretty specific expectations. And looking back, I wish we had been more specific. And then we had our teacher evaluation framework from Charlotte Danielson that was very robust and gave us a lot of language and gave us very specific leveled performance indicators, because it was a true rubric. And then, of course, you have other things like your school-specific expectations. Like, maybe in your school, every day begins with a morning meeting, or maybe every class begins with a warm-up, or something like that. That's school-specific. And my challenge to people is, if you have an expectation, don't just say do X. Actually, turn it into a rubric, and people will be far more clear. And get people involved in developing that rubric so that it truly is a shared expectation.
Now, some people, you often hear the argument against, not against, but something anybody would argue against being in classrooms. But you hear people say, I'm just chained to my office. I have too much to do. You go pretty deep, and you definitely speak my language with it on the kind of the productivity end of things, like the more mechanical things of, managing your inbox, being clear about communication expectations around email and texting. And you want to talk a little bit about how you arrived at some of that thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an issue that affects everybody, right? Like, there are no not busy administrators who just have the luxury of getting into classrooms in their spare time. Like, there is no spare time. We know if we're going to do this, if we're going to get into classrooms every day, it's going to have to be on purpose, and it's going to take some effort to make that happen. And I have talked to people who genuinely are so busy with emergencies all day long that they really don't have a lot of time to do this. But I think for the most part, that's rare in our profession. Almost everyone can carve out little bits of time here and there. And we're not talking 4 hours a day. We're talking 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there. 3 times a day really, I think is plenty to get around to everybody. And from a productivity standpoint, I have long been a student of productivity and also very, perplexed at my own failures to stick with any given system.
It's honest.
Like, I can tell you all of the systems that are out there, and I can tell you that I've at one point or another failed to stick with every single one of them. So I guess my bottom line on productivity is do what works for you, but be aware that whatever system or strategy or technique or tool you're implementing needs to free up your brain, because there is no way to be a good instructional leader when your brain is fried. We've got to create that mental bandwidth. It's not time so much as it is mental bandwidth. So in the book, when I talk about getting your desk clear every day, if you haven't read the book and you just hear, get your desk clear every day, who has time for that? I have more important things to do. Well, it's not that filing papers is the most important thing you should do. It's that if you're going to get into classrooms and have really good evidence-based conversations with teachers, your brain has to be ready for that. And a desk that is, I'm looking at my desk right now, and there is stuff on it that doesn't need to be there. I eat my dog food here. If your brain is overwhelmed because of that clutter or because of fear that something is waiting for you and you have to kind of avoid it. If there are 500 emails in my inbox and I haven't read most of them, and I don't know if some of them are from the superintendent, I don't know if some of them are complaints from parents, there's a psychological and a cognitive cost to that uncertainty, and it manifests itself as avoidance and as a lack of focus. So my overall strategy for this is get current. Just know what you're dealing with, get it somewhat organized so that you can come back to it and make some progress and make sure that you're working on the right things. And there are a lot of specific systems for that in the book, whether we're talking about paper or talking about email or talking about people contacting you. Like, if you've got people sending you Twitter direct messages, and you've got people sending you texts, and you've got people sending you emails and leaving you voicemails and leaving construction paper notes written with a vis-a-vis pen on your chair, like all those different forms of communication make it really hard to prioritize, because you can't hold up the construction paper note and the tweet and the text message next to each other and say, okay, which one of these should I do first? Like, it just, after 5 or 10 things, it just becomes a jumble. Like, we can't keep it all in our short-term memory. So I really like to have everything in one system, and it doesn't matter too much what that system is. You can use sticky notes if you want. You can have a whiteboard if you want. You can do an app on your phone. But having one system where you can really put everything and say, okay, I can't do all of this today, but I can look at it all and decide what I'm going to do. And part of what I'm going to do today is get into classrooms.
Well, and I appreciate that you include this in the book, because it reminds me of how teacher ed programs used to not bother much with classroom management and focus more on the larger, John Dewey theories. And it was very hard for teachers to teach the large and deal with the larger issues because of classroom management. And I think the same thing happens with school leaders, that, we talk a lot about theories and instructional leadership, but we don't acknowledge the hard, cold fact of how hard it is to get a handle on your to-do list. So I thank you for including this in a book about instructional leadership, where you might think, well, what place does this have? And Justin does include some real tips in the book if anybody wants to look at them. And he also does reference other books like David Allen's Getting Things Done and others, where you really can go into detail and take advantage of this opportunity to get yourself organized so you can get into the classrooms.
And then we nerded out on Getting Things Done a while ago, right, Jen? I think we did. There's
a podcast.
There's a podcast on that
book.
one. I love that book. And I think one of the things that I also think people miss is that it's kind of a positive feedback loop or self-fulfilling prophecy, where once you get out and you're in classrooms more, it's going to cut down on the volume of the other stuff coming at you. Because if a teacher knows, geez, I know I got this question for Justin, I'm going to send him an email. Nah, you know what? I'll probably see him today or tomorrow. I'll just catch him then. So because they know that you're out and about, it's going to cut down on that other nonsense coming at you from different angles. Yeah,
and I think relationships are hugely efficient right? Like we think of relationships and efficiency as kind of enemies. Like if I'm going to be efficient, it's going to be at the price of relationships. But relationships are a huge source of efficiency because people can just talk to us. We can just communicate directly. There's not this awkwardness. There's not this, go to the office and fill out the form to talk to Justin. Like you can just talk and be direct and get things done and work together as a team. That teamwork, that trust really becomes normal. Yeah, when we're in classrooms more. Very well said.
Well, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. I know we didn't go through the 21 days. That's why people need to buy the book and read it. And so if people want to learn more about you and your work, Justin, where should we send them?
Well, if people are interested in this topic in particular, the best place to go is instructionalleadershipchallenge.com, because that is our free program that kind of takes you through some of the big ideas in the book. And we've got an all new version of that for people. If you have seen the version where I have a beard, that's the old version. And the new version is streamlined. I am clean shaven, so that's how you know you're in the new one. And really, we wanted to make it easy for people to get started. So one of the changes we're making in the new Instructional Leadership Challenge is it's fewer videos and more action. So a lot of those same strategies there, and then there's more in the book. But instructionalleadershipchallenge.com is the way to sign up for that, and then everything else we have is at principalcenter.com.
Excellent. And Jenn, if people want to find out more about the main idea, or maybe even get a summary of the book, what should we do?
Sure. People can go to themainidea.net if you would like to request a free copy of this summary of this book for having listened to this podcast. Shoot me an email. And also, I do have summaries of other books that can help support the ideas that Justin mentioned, such as some productivity books, such as David Allen's Getting Things Done, or Maya Hanks' The Together Teacher.
Oh, that's a great book.
Yeah, there's some other organizational books as well.
Good. And I'll plug my own stuff. Go back and we've got podcast episodes on, productivity in general, but also going deep on specific things like email, office organization, working with your secretary, all that kind of stuff that all feeds into and fits into the idea of getting you more quickly able to do the stuff you have to do so that you can get out of your office and get into classrooms. So thank you so much, Jenn and Justin. This was a great conversation. We may have to part two it at some point.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And Jenn, thanks so much for talking about the book.
Great ideas in the book and excellent conversation with organizer Mike. Thanks for all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.